Welcome to Learning Leaders Spotlight, the podcast where we interview learning leaders of today to help the learning leaders of tomorrow. I'm your host, Leanne Langford. I'm the president of Training Pros, an L&D contract staffing company. At Training Pros, we like to say, when you have more projects than people, let us find the right consultant to start your project with confidence. I'm really pleased today to have my guest, Nicolle Billmyre, with me. Nicolle is the Senior Director of Talent and Organizational Development at Crossmark. Hi, Nicolle. Welcome.
Hi, Leanne. It's great to be here today. I'm excited for us to have a conversation.
I am too. I find your background to be very interesting with both the L&D and the OD combined in your role. It's going to be an interesting conversation. So can you tell our audience a 60-second overview of who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. So as you said, I lead talent and organizational development, training and development for Crossmark. And, my role really covers a lot of different areas. It can be everything from succession and career pathing to employee engagement, to learning and development, to performance management. All those areas, as we think about our people and we want them to grow and develop within an organization, sit in my domain.
That sounds like a really fun and exciting position to be in.
It is.
Those are a lot of the topics I studied in grad school, but I ended up, even though I studied all that, I still went in one direction instead of the full gamut like you have. So it's got to feel good. You must be impacting a lot of people.
I hope so on a daily basis.
Yeah. So what about, how did you find your way into OD and L&D?
Similar to you, when I was in college, I was in a different type of background. I was studying government and law. So my first real job out of the university was at a legal organization, American Arbitration Association. And I was really focused on the legal side, arbitrations and mediations. And I found I was always the person that was asked to train people because I loved to really train and develop people, mentor them, coach them. So as I started doing that over, the course of my day job, when American Arbitration Association decided to create a university, they came to me and said, we want you to lead this university, lead our learning efforts, both internally and externally. And I jumped at the opportunity. I really thought back even to, my childhood, when we think about being young women, oftentimes we're playing school with our friends as thinking about kind of those first jobs and before we really start to think about what we want to do. And while I might have wanted to be in the legal field, I found my passion with really helping others develop and grow. And then from there on, I stayed in that field.
I think that's a fantastic story. You're the first person I've interviewed that came through the legal field to get here. A lot of people came from school teachers or they studied a different topic and just found their way into training because they liked to train, which is what most of us end up doing.
Yeah. And I would, and add on to it too, though I started off in really the learning and development side, what I found is you could be even more impactful when you stretch and go into the talent side of things. So learning and development is fabulous. We want to be able to provide the best development opportunities for our employees at our organizations. But when you tap into talent, you can start to have some of those career conversations with individuals to understand where do they want to go, or how do they move from an individual contributor to a leader, and what development skills do they need? So I think of it really that the two are tied so closely together, but it covers so many areas. So it was just a natural area for me to move into and step out of just the L&D space and focus really on what's the full picture of our employee. What is their engagement? What does their career pathing look like? How do we keep those high potentials retained within the organization and engaged?
Can you share with our audience the biggest changes you've seen in the last 3 to 5 years in both talent management and organizational development?
Absolutely. I think obviously we've been through a pandemic, and that was challenging as a lot of our organizations went from being in the office every day, whether that was spread across the entire United States or across a global environment, to really being a work from home for many years. And while we'd already really scratched the surface and been in the virtual learning space, we weren't doing virtual learning entirely. So you might have still had classroom training. You might have had in-person onboarding, all of those things that were happening in a job. So when I started at Crossmark, for example, in 2021, we were completely 100% virtual. So I didn't meet people face-to-face initially. I wasn't onboarded face-to-face. I didn't go through any in-person training to learn the organization or learn about my job. So we as L&D professionals and talent professionals really had to shift and think about all those things that we were used to doing in person. We had to adapt into the virtual space. Thankfully, we'd already started doing it. Many of us are on Zoom or WebEx or Teams or GoTo and, had started to get comfortable with that. But if we weren't strong facilitators, if we had a team of facilitators, we really had to adapt and think about, how do I take all this information that we've been doing in an in-person environment, or we've done in a way that, wasn't making connections through a virtual space, and transform it. So that was one of the big pieces I think we all learned. When we came back, and many of us did come back to the office or in a hybrid environment, we then had to transition back and think about, okay, we're not simply all virtual now. How do we do this? But I think, from an L&D and talent perspective, what we gained from the pandemic is we realized we could make those connections, especially in organizations that were across the country or across the globe, make those connections in a different way than we had pre-pandemic. And then I'll jump forward maybe to more recently. I think we're seeing A&I big time. And you've probably heard this from others. A lot of people that are on my team or in the L&D space ask me all the time, do you think we're going to become obsolete because of A&I? And I say, absolutely not. It's here. And we can get so much from it from, again, both that L&D and talent side. Talent maybe more on the analytics and details of things. Learning and development to help our instructional designers to create content quicker and faster. But then I take a step back and say, we're not going to become obsolete because, anytime you reach out to an organization and you get a chatbot or you get a virtual person helping you, they're not real. They don't necessarily understand what you're asking, and you have to ask it in several different ways. Or, when you get the responses back, well, that's programmed. And I think as L&D, we have to remember we can't go with those generalizations. We've got to hit people where they are. We've got to make sure we're creating the impact and creating that human touch that is so critical to development. So I'd say, although A&I is here and it's not going to go anywhere, it's not going to make us obsolete. It's actually just going to amplify what we're already doing.
Fantastic. I think you may have already answered the next question then, which is about where do you see us going in the next 5 to 10 years?
I'd actually say probably a little bit different too. I mean, A&I, yes, will play a role, but I'll take it a step further. Learning is going to have to be more transformative for organizations because, anytime we send anybody to an external type of learning type of program or conference, whatever it might be, or we grab maybe an off-the-shelf type of learning content piece, almost always what we hear from our employees is, it's too general. I need this more specific to our organization or to my role. And A&I is not good at doing that. That's where that human touch comes in. And when I say transformative, we are becoming more and more of an agile workforce. As we think about companies shifting people into different roles and expecting them to pick it up and run quickly, what does that look like? So we've got to think about, combining that A&I, but also bringing in metrics and analytics, which is difficult in L&D. A lot of us probably in the past have relied on feedback like SurveyMonkey. Let's send a survey out after a course and get feedback, but it doesn't provide true data and analytics. And we are seeing, business insights and data and analytics being one of the big talking points for these past 2 years. Everybody wants somebody that's maybe a data scientist to really understand, was something a success? What do we need to improve upon? What are the skill gaps? And I don't think we're there in the L&D space yet. I think we're going there, and we're going to have to go there. Otherwise, the C-suite is going to find some of the L&D individuals and departments maybe not as relevant as we'd like them to be. They're not providing as many insights as we want. They're not justifying the expense that maybe we want to spend for the outcome. So that's what I'm really talking about transformative and being agile. But also, we've got different coming into play. This is probably the first time ever, I don't want to date myself here, but where we've been in a workforce where there's so many different generations. And I think back to when I joined, my first real professional job and, the fax machines. And I joke about this a little bit because, I remember email was coming into play. I guess I am aging myself a little bit here. But getting comfortable with emailing documents versus faxing documents, getting comfortable with the e-learning environment, all those types of things that we think about. Well, now this next generation that we're seeing coming into the workforce, they don't want to sit in 5-day classes, 5-day onboarding or 5-day leadership development, whatever that might be. They want bite-sized micro-learnings. They want quick, that they can apply to their job. They want to be involved in case studies and applying those skills immediately versus the generic kind that we've seen in past years. So I think, as we think futuristically, we've got to think about the different generations because they're going to have different learning types. Maybe not across the board, all the same, because we don't want to generalize. But there are some similarities with particular generations on how they learn. And we've got to think about that. And we've got to adapt our own styles from whatever generation we're from and what we're used to say, where do I, again, meet the learner where they're at or where they're going to thrive the best? So those are a couple of the areas that I think about as we go forward in these next probably 3 to 5 years.
That is a lot. That is a lot. Even in the small company like Training Pros, we have 4 generations working in our company right now. It's varied, and you can honestly, you can really tell the difference with work styles for each generation.
Right.
And then you're right about Gen X. I have Gen Z. I have 2 Gen Z children and 1 Gen Z employee, and they approach everything much differently than we did.
Right.
I remember when I was leaving to go out of town I do a 1-day coaching program once a quarter for 1 day in person. And my oldest was saying, well, why do you have to go? Why can't you just do it online or sit? And I'm like,
right.
It's not the same. Yes, it is the same. Why wouldn't it be the same? I'm like, it's okay. Okay, I want to go.
Right. But I think you're touching on a really important part. I think that as, L&D professionals, a lot of times when we're in the room with someone and we can read the body language, read the facial expressions, when we know they're not multitasking and they're not doing something else on their phone or their computer, we know that they're connecting more to the content, or we can read the cues and adapt. So there is a lot of benefit to that, being in the same room with somebody when you're, facilitating or leading around a piece. But we're going to have to think about that. What does that look like in a virtual space, and continue to adapt, because those generations are thinking about it that way. And companies think about it from a cost perspective too. We can't often bring in, 20 or 50 people and fly them all into one location. So that's going to be an area that I think we're going to have to stretch and continue to evolve.
Agreed. Let's shift gears. Who was your most memorable or most influential professional mentor?
I'm going to go back a little bit back to American Arbitration Association, and her name was Christine, and Christine was tough, and she scared some people, but I loved it because Christine would not spin anything to try and make it come and sound a certain way. She was always the one that immediately, whatever I presented an idea, would come back with 3 or 4 questions. And I learned so much from this, in that I thought through from business case perspectives or from influencing perspectives of, what is this person's mindset? And I thought about Christine, for example. What's important to her? What are going to be the questions she's going to ask when I'm done? When I thought I've covered everything I need to, she always had the most intelligent questions that would come forward. She never did it in judgment, though. She did it in a way that allowed me to really grow, to think about, okay, I need to get out of my own lens. I need to think about the person I'm talking to and what's going to be important to them, and think through all possible questions and think about all possible answers. And from that, I really learned that you can come across as tough and strong, but also have that side that is very coaching and mentoring. And I grew so much from her, just from learning, again, I needed to get out of my own perspective. I needed to think about who I'm having the conversation with, who I'm building the relationship with, how I'm building trust, and how I'm giving myself credibility by the things I'm saying and how I'm prepared to answer any questions.
So I love that story for multiple reasons. Number one, you had a professional mentor early in your career that really helped you next level up, really grow towards being a leader. But number two, I loved what you said about her being tough, and yet she had all of these other qualities that made her helpful to others and to help people grow. It's always been a balance for women in the workplace, and maybe it's better now, but when we were younger, it was difficult to balance. Are you nice at work, or are you the mean woman?
Right. Right. And you're right. And I mean, I remember very much, and I had to take lessons from, I know sometimes as a first-time leader, I was intimidating or scary sometimes because of the approach I would take. And I think we have to remember we can continue to grow. We have to continue to really find out from others too, what are maybe our blind spots so that we can develop and really become the best possible leaders we can.
Fantastic. In today's world, when you're looking to bring in new team members or new consultants, what is the skill that you find the most difficult to find?
It's a really interesting question. I think the skill is out there, but it's hard. I would say hard to identify would probably be emotional intelligence. Because as you know, when you're interviewing someone, whether it's on video or whether it's in person, they've probably prepared for the conversation. They probably have everything lined up about what they want to say. You're not getting into really personal stuff either in those initial conversations. So you just don't know what their emotional intelligence level is. You don't know, are they willing to put themselves in someone else's shoes to understand what you're trying to accomplish or understand what your objectives are or understand how to influence you. So I think you get a lot of preparedness at the beginning of meeting consultants or meeting new employees, and you don't necessarily know what's under the surface. You haven't peeled back the layers yet, and that can be really challenging. So you can have somebody that's really qualified and put them in a role, but if they lack emotional intelligence, then they may not be able to handle change management. They may not be able to handle difficult relationships. They may have such a strong viewpoint that they're not willing to understand where they need to compromise or collaborate. So while it's not necessarily one you typically think of, that's the one I say because it's just so hard to know in those early days and in those early conversations whether they have it or whether they don't.
I couldn't agree more. I don't know how you could judge whether someone has emotional intelligence in an interview. And you're right, we're always on our best behavior in an interview. And I know I prepare for days before I would have an interview. Where do you get your industry news and information?
I would say there's a couple different places. I've got a great partner, GP Strategies, who has helped me a lot as it relates, and I think about leadership development. But I also think of Harvard Business Review is a great one. And then I'd say CCL, Center for Creative Leadership, is a go-to because, again, I think of that term creative leadership. I think they're always pushing the envelope a little bit to look at things differently. And I remember back many, many years ago when I was actually creating learning content. Again, I was always doing it from the perspective of how did I want to learn? And it always seemed to be similar in nature. As I'd create one course, I'd use it as the model for the next course. And, I might be tapping into my Addy approach. But what I found is CCL helped me think about it differently. And that was the first time too ever that I learned about design thinking. And that was probably 15 years ago. And it really helped me look at things differently. So I'd say those are probably my three quick go-tos. I've got so many others, but those are the ones that if I'm going to, open up Google and type something in real quick, that's probably where I'm going to go and see what resources do they have first.
That's going to be very helpful. Okay, now the tough question. What is one book that you would recommend anyone wanting to become a learning leader read?
I'm going to cheat and I'm probably going to give you two because I just brought up design thinking. So there's a design thinking book, Design Thinking for Training by Sharon Baller, I think is her name. It's been a minute since I've read it. So I remember getting so much wealth out of it, and I took it forward and thinking about how I really developed classes, whether they were virtual, whether they were self-paced, e-learning, and how I inspired my L&D team to think about L&D differently. But then there's another one, and it's a newer one. And as I think about it, I think it even has new in the title. It's a new L&D mindset for the ever-changing workplace, I believe is what it's called. And it's by J.D. Dillon. I think it's only been out for about 2 or 3 years. But I remember reading it, and it was a short read. But there were lots of things I thought about, kind of some of your questions today, thinking about how are we evolving? What do we need to do differently in the L&D space? Because again, as we grow up throughout, this field, we probably get a little bit stuck in the ways we do things. And how do we think about, again, I'll say what I said earlier, meet the learner where they are. Think about learners differently. You might have a person that's a visual learner. You might have a person that wants text. You might have a person that just wants to have a conversation. You might have someone that wants to do the self-paced learning. Maybe they don't like those group settings. Maybe they don't like those, let me think through a case study or interactive learning, which we know can intimidate people. So JD's book really made me think about it from a perspective of how are we evolving? How do we need to look at our approach differently so that we can continue to grow in our impact to our employees?
2 great answers. Wonderful. I think I have one of the books on my shelf, and
great.
We've had JD. We've had JD on our program before. So,
that's wonderful.
Yeah.
And I'll switch gears. If I was thinking about the talent space, now I'll really cheat. There's a third book, and I pull it off my shelf. It's Influencing Without Authority. So it's sitting over here because I think about it. And in the talent space, as well as the L&D space, you're constantly having to influence your stakeholders. Maybe it's not necessarily the learners that I'm talking about in this moment, but it's the stakeholders to say, we need to do this learning and development approach. And I'm the L&D expert, or I'm the talent expert. And thinking about how we influence those stakeholders or those C-suite executives. So I'd say, if you haven't yet tapped into developing your influencing skills, for anybody listening, I'd say that is key. It's going to help with your credibility. It's going to help to build your relationships and build trust as you're working in the L&D and talent space.
That's excellent point. We do. I read several books like that in grad school, things like Getting Things Done When You're Not in Charge. And, it's all about trying to influence and get the programs that are needed, but you have to get buy-in from the C-suite in order to get those going. Well, you have provided a lot of great insights here today, Nicolle. I really appreciate you being on our show. As a thank you, we would like to plant 5 trees in your name.
Thank you.
This month we're doing urban reforestation planting. So inside cities where trees are desperately needed, we'll sponsor 5 trees in your name. And
I love that. That is wonderful. Thank you so much, Leanne.
You're so welcome. And again, thank you for being on the show. And if you're listening at home, thank you for listening to this week's Learning Leader Spotlight, and be sure to tune in next week. Thanks so much.